now we have his plan. He didn't like Theresa May's plan. He resigned from the cabinet more than a year ago over that, and more than 3 years ago, he was leading the Leave campaign. Finally, we have his version of how you come out of the EU. But we only have, by most people's estimation, 10 days of negotiations, potentially, in which it can be properly ironed out and agreed with the EU. They want it nailed down a few days before the actual summit. That's how they operate. What we know is that the DUP have moved on one important bit of terrain that they weren't moving on before. They are accepting the idea that they could be in the same sort of regulatory orbit as the EU when it comes to single market regulations. Although with that they want a veto at Stormont, and they themselves have a veto over Stormont, the way the rules work there. So that leaves quite a lot of people queasy. But on the other area of rules that come under any kind of inspection regime, the single market, the customs union rules, they are not moving on that. And the EU does not look impressed by the reassurance that is in the documents that we've seen. There's legal text, 17 pages with the EU as well, but we haven't seen that. But the other stuff that's knocking around is not impressing Dublin, not impressing Brussels. They don't feel that the British government has really ironed out the problem whereby there could still be inspections on vehicles. Britain says they might happen well away from the border, somewhere very harmless and hard to locate, the rest of it. But Brussels is not convinced by that at all. But it is not saying it openly right now with quite the candour you might expect given the reaction we're hearing behind the scenes, and that's because they just want to probe a little. Because they're not convinced this is the full and final offer. They just want to check if there could be a little bit more movement that might discomfort the DUP a bit. And that's going to be explored in a few days to come. But as I say, there isn't much time. Remember back to the summer, the leadership campaign, when Boris Johnson said that he thought the chances of not getting a deal with Europe were 1,000,000 to 1. Well, right at this very moment, with the time left, with the distance between the two parties, that feels like a pretty inaccurate prediction. As he arrived to speak, the cabinet had only just been briefed on the government's Brexit proposals. They were still digesting it all and couldn't see which way he was coming at them. The style could not have been further from Theresa May's, as he rehearsed the battle lines for a general election, which Number 10 wants done before November is out.
If Parliament were a reality TV show, then the whole lot of us, I'm afraid, would have been voted out of the jungle by now. But at least we'd have had the consolation of watching the Speaker being forced to eat a kangaroo testicle.
The Prime Minister confirmed with 29 days to go until the day he promised Britain would leave, he had now sent proposals for a revised withdrawal agreement to Brussels.
Today in Brussels, we are tabling what I believe are constructive and reasonable proposals. Yes, this is a compromise by the UK, and I hope very much that our friends understand that and compromise in their turn. Because if we fail to get an agreement because of what is essentially a technical discussion on the exact nature of future customs checks, when that technology is improving the whole time, then let us be in no doubt, conference, of what the alternative is. The alternative is no deal. And that is not an outcome we want. It is not an outcome we seek at all. But let me tell you, my friends, it is an outcome for which we are ready. Are we ready for it? Yes, we are. Are we determined to resolve this? Yes, we are.
He risked inflaming his critics by dismissing customs checks in Northern Ireland as a technical discussion. His critics worry he hasn't worked out how to avoid the checking process becoming a target for terrorists. The EU also worries lighter checks would mean smuggling and lost revenue. The speech repeatedly broke into humour. He said not everyone in his family opposed the Brexit he backs.
I know that there are some keen students of alleged divisions in my family on matters of the EU. But I want you to know, conference, that I have kept my ace up my sleeve. my mother voted leave.
I didn't know that, his father said. The bulk of the speech was about spending on police, roads and hospitals. Promises, he said, could only be fulfilled once Brexit was out of the way.
Conference, let's get Brexit done and let's bring this country together. Thank you very much.
The message, being road-tested for an election, shift the Brexit boulder out of the way and we can skip to a land of Blairite spending and tough law and order. But will his proposals shift the boulder? Under the plan, the whole UK would leave the EU customs union in 15 months' time. So with Northern Ireland outside the EU customs union, high-tech customs checks would take place, but also some physical checks, somewhere on the supply lines. Northern Ireland would follow EU regulations for agriculture and goods, so there would be checks on these as they move to Britain outside the EU rules. But Northern Ireland's Assembly would have regular votes on whether to follow EU rules, starting next year and every 4 years after that. But the DUP will be able to operate a veto at the Stormont Assembly. Last night at Tory conference, Boris Johnson's rhetoric seemed to be merging with theirs.
Our Prime Minister. No surrender, Boris.
Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and long may it remain so. Let it remain so forever. Let it remain so forever. My friends,
No surrender, Boris.
These scenes won't have settled nerves in Dublin, where the proposals got a chilly reception.
But what I can say from the leaks that we've seen, that what's being put forward is not promising and does not appear to form the basis for an agreement.
Despite Number 10 briefing that the new proposal would be a final take-it-or-leave-it offer, a letter from the Prime Minister to the EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker says he considers it a reasonable compromise, the broad landing zone in which I believe a deal can begin to take shape. Both Michel Barnier, the EU's Brexit negotiator, and Jean-Claude Juncker were careful not to dismiss the proposals out of hand.
My team met the British team today and we received a legal proposal. There is progress. But to be frank, a lot of work still needs to be done.
The EU will now try to probe how much more give there is in Boris Johnson's proposals. Can they meet Ireland's needs? Could Boris Johnson even get it through Parliament if the EU signed off on it? But right now, they're a long way from that.
Well, what is the reaction to Mr Johnson's proposals in Brussels? Our political correspondent Paul McNamara is there for us now. Paul.
Yes, Kathy, well, before the meeting, things sounded relatively positive. After the meeting, very different. And the view at the moment from these corridors, from the EU Parliament, is not a positive one. That's not really all that surprising. The noises we've been hearing all afternoon is just how far short this deal fell of what the EU wanted. But what has been surprising after that meeting is just how outspoken the EU have been. So just a couple of minutes ago, the Brexit Steering Group committee meeting of MEPs has broken up. The chair of that committee, Guy Verhofstadt, came out. This is what he had to say.
But I can tell you that the first reaction in the Brexit Steering Group was not positive. Not positive in the sense that we don't think that it is really the safeguard that Ireland need. But tomorrow we will give point after point the reasons for that, what is not acceptable in the proposal.
Is it a basis for negotiation?
I said to you that tomorrow there will be a written statement about it, and the first assessment of nearly every member in the Brexit Steering Group was not positive at all.
Do you think it's a serious effort, or is this just trying to put the blame on you?
I think that last point was not so bad. I think that
So there we go, not just saying that this is a bad deal, but almost insinuating there that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, may not be operating in good faith. So what from here? Well, tomorrow we'll get that point-by-point detail of the reasons why the EU thinks this is such a bad deal. And then after that, more talks will be happening. Just how much posturing is happening here? Well, we've got a sense of that from what they're not saying. What they're not saying is that they're entering tunnel negotiations. Remember, just before Theresa May got her withdrawal agreement, everyone hunkered down, they locked the doors, and they engaged in serious talks, not briefing anything out, to get and hammer out a deal. They are not doing that right now. And what is happening right now is that clock is ticking down.
Well, now, we did ask number 10 for a minister to come on and talk to us about the government's Brexit deal, but nobody was available. From the House of Commons is Labour MP Hilary Benn, chair of the Committee on Exiting the European Union. And in our Westminster studio is Rachel Maclean, Conservative MP for Redditch. Rachel Maclean, what do you make of this?
Well, it looks to me like it's a pretty sensible and reasonable basis for a compromise on all sides. And I think what we all need to do now as members across the House, because I think there's a widespread awareness that we need to move on from this divisive issue to other domestic priorities. And I really hope and believe that members will feel able to support it when it comes back to the House of Commons.
Hilary Benn, that's an interesting answer because it's one that many people express, exhaustion, and therefore, whilst some of them, including indeed Rachel, were Remainers, they're now happy just to sort of dump it and get on.
Well, if this is going to go anywhere, it's going to require a positive response from the European Union. And I think the problem with the proposals are, first of all, it requires two borders, a border in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, but crucially, a customs border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that will involve, as the Prime Minister has admitted, checks. And when the British government and the EU signed up to the joint declaration in December 2017, they were committed to no checks, no infrastructure. And I'm afraid that has been set on one side by the government. Secondly, the proposal that the Northern Ireland Assembly, which isn't, of course, meeting at the moment, should have the final say on whether there is in effect, Northern Ireland is in the single market for agriculture, foods and manufactured goods, is going to be, I think, a real problem for the EU, because how can you have an insurance policy, John, that everyone can rely on if one party can decide whether that policy is going to apply? And thirdly, the reaction from businesses in Northern Ireland this evening to the proposals as they've emerged has been anything but positive. They're very anxious about the implications for them of these checks and the uncertain future that they're facing.
Could I ask you something technical? Wouldn't you imagine, with 13 days to go to the crucial European meeting, wouldn't you imagine that there would be 24-hour negotiating talks? There doesn't appear to have been any hotting up of the UK-EU talks, whatever.
Well, I suppose that's really a question to be directed to the government, who haven't come on your programme this evening. But for the first month of his prime ministership, Boris Johnson basically said, get rid of the backstop and give me a ring when you've decided to accede to my demands. And so this has come quite late in the day. I think the reason that the government has now tabled these proposals is because his original plan to have a general election was closed off by Parliament. And it remains to be seen whether this can go anywhere with the European Union and whether it will be approved by the House of Commons. But what we must avoid, John, in all circumstances, is while this debate takes place about the plans that have been submitted, we've got to avoid a no-deal Brexit. And my worry remains that the Prime Minister is still saying, if my proposals are not accepted by the European Union, we're going to leave on the 31st of October without a deal. Parliament has passed a law to prevent him from doing that. It requires him, if there is no agreement, to write a letter to Donald Tusk to seek an extension. I hope very much the EU would grant one in those circumstances. And it doesn't help matters at all if the Prime Minister is suggesting that he may not comply with the law that Parliament has passed.
Rachel Maclean, as I mentioned earlier, you were a Remainer, but it sounded to me as if you are indeed going to vote leave whatever the hell happens.
Well, I don't think it's whatever the hell happens, to be honest. I was a Remainer, like many other colleagues, but like many other colleagues, and indeed, like my constituents and the rest of the country, I am first and foremost a Democrat, and I recognise that in any vote that we have, especially an exercise in democracy as extensive and significant as this one that we've just had, where 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union, democracy only works if the people that are on the side of the argument that didn't actually succeed on that occasion accept that result. And so I was very clear on the morning after the referendum, in fact, before I was even a Member of Parliament, that we absolutely have to leave the European Union. And I've said this all along, and I voted 3 times for a deal in the House of Commons. And, you know, I would just sort of gently say to Hillary and other colleagues in the Labour Party, I don't want a no deal. And if he doesn't want a no deal, I really very much hope that he will back the deal that the Prime Minister comes back with, so that we can actually move on, which is what I think actually Labour voters want, and voters of all different political persuasions. They actually want us to move on and address the serious issues facing the country, whether it's more police on the streets, whether it's levelling up school funding, whether it's actually supporting our NHS. These are the priorities that people in my constituency, and I'm sure in Hillary's, expressed to me on a daily basis.
Well, like so many, strong on democracy, a 3% difference in an advisory referendum, and not an inch is being given to the other 16 million who voted the other way. Surely there does have to be some accommodation of the reality that this country is utterly split.
Yes, I think that's a very fair point. And every time I've spoken in the House of Commons, I have said and acknowledged that there are divisions, and they cut across our benches. We are divided in our party, and the Labour Party are divided on their side as well. At the end of the day, we stood on a manifesto in 2017, as did the Labour Party, saying we would deliver Brexit and we would seek a deal. Now the opportunity has come for us to vote for this deal, which does actually recognise a lot of the concerns expressed to me by passionate Remain voters around all the issues. And what I would say is, if people are saying, well, this deal isn't good enough, really, I mean, what specifically are the areas where they're not happy? Because there has to be compromise from everybody.
Right.
I think Leave voters have compromised a lot. I think people who voted Remain have compromised. Everybody now needs to recognise that they can't dance on the head of a pin anymore, and we can't let ideology and perfection be the enemy of a pragmatic acceptance that it's not good for the country to continue dragging this out endlessly.
Well, Hilary Benn, at a critical moment in the testimony there from Rachel McLean, you were shaking your head. What was all that about?
Well, I'll tell you, because this is even worse than Theresa May's deal. Theresa May, at least, followed through on her commitment to keep an open border in Northern Ireland. And as you know, John, from your many years of reporting, the peace and prosperity that has been brought to Northern Ireland as a result of the Good Friday Agreement is about the psychology of the peace process. The fact that people living there can be British or Irish or both. People can live their lives across that border. There are no checks, there are no infrastructure, there are no controls. And we know that Boris Johnson, having now set that commitment on one side by openly admitting that his proposals would require customs checks in Northern Ireland, wherever they are undertaken, that is going to create a difficulty and a risk to the peace process.
Does it
and the result of the referendum is not a commitment
itself?
Well, I don't think it upholds the principle of the Good Friday Agreement, and more than that, it's not in keeping with the law that Parliament passed in 2018, the EU Withdrawal Act, which said that there could not be controls, checks or infrastructure that were not in place before exit day. Parliament voted to ensure that that border remained open as it is today, and what the Prime Minister has put forward to the EU this afternoon, I'm afraid, is not in keeping with that. And the result of the referendum is not a commitment to sign up to any old deal. And the fact remains that what Boris Johnson is proposing is a more distant economic relationship, will create problems in Northern Ireland, will result in friction in our trade across the Channel, which is bad for business, investment and jobs in the
Hilary
future.
Benn, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And indeed, Rachel McLean, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Thanks, John. We'll return to Brussels now. And joining me is Philippe Lambert, who sits on the Brexit steering group in the European Parliament. Mr. Lambert, you've just been briefed on the deal. Was there much to like in what you heard?
No, not a lot. And I heard one of your interlocutors speaking about people refusing to compromise on ideological grounds. Let me just give you one example. If we had if we were to accept Prime Minister Johnson's proposals, basically we would accept to commit legally and forever to putting no border checks between Ireland, the Republic, and Northern Ireland, forever, okay? And then maybe in the future, maybe or maybe not, there would be regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the rest of and the Republic, dependent on the consent of the Stormont institutions, which at the moment are not functioning. So basically, he wants us to write a blank check saying we are going to keep a 500-kilometer border open into the single market, regardless of whether or not the Northern Irish institutions will consent to a regulatory agreement sometime in the future.
Well, he said the Stormont Assembly has to approve the deal.
Of things that Prime Minister Johnson is putting on the table.
But he says the Stormont Assembly has to approve the deal, so they get a say on that, and at that point you can then have your say as well. I mean, you talk of compromise. Shouldn't the EU be looking to compromise, as the UK says that it has?
Well, of course, I understand the blame game that is going on. Again, you apparently do not understand what I'm saying. Basically, the Johnson deal that he proposes wants us to make concessions, and then maybe, and this is totally hypothetical, maybe the concessions that he announced as being big steps forward to the European Union will come in the future, because consent means consent. If there's no consent, then read the text, well, the alignment will not happen.
Well, but aren't you worried? You say you're worried about getting the blame for this. Okay, so you're worried about getting the blame for this.
Well, I'm not worried. I'm absolutely not worried about the blame, because I mean we did not decide on Brexit, but no one can blame the European Union to refuse something that no state on the planet would ever even consider. Do you imagine that even the United Kingdom would keep an open border while with a partner whose legislation may evolve in any way?
But he's admitted there will be some checks.
The intent of the British government, well, that is not exactly what he said. Read the papers, because, well, I took a while to read them and we are still analyzing them. Again, there's a difference between a speech in a convention and legal text that is sent to the European Union. Basically, what I'm telling you is that we should commit to leave the border open, even if the regulatory alignment never comes. And this, no state on earth would ever agree to, least of all the United Kingdom.
You say you're not worried about getting the blame. Are you not worried when the Prime Minister stands up and says that if there's not an agreement, it would be a failure of statecraft for which everyone would be blamed, the EU and the UK?
Well, again, I'm not interested in blame, I'm interested in reality. And if the cost of conceding basically to the inner contradictions of the Tory party means ruining the single market, well, we are not going to pay that cost. And indeed, and people have to understand that, if no deal Brexit happens, it will be damaging to the EU, of course, but accepting the kind of proposals that Boris Johnson made today as is, that is without any change, would be much more damaging to us than a no-deal Brexit. And between two evils, and they are two evils, I agree with that, we have to choose, and that's our responsibility as elected leaders, we have to choose the lesser one.
OK, so how likely, in percentage terms, is a deal by October the 17th, the EU Council?
Well, frankly speaking, we are very far from it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that some very fundamental elements of the proposals of Prime Minister Johnson are very remote from what would be required to achieve a deal, well, at any date, by the way. It's not a question of time, it's a question of political willingness. And frankly speaking, what we have seen today is so far from achieving, and I think Hilary Benn was also very clear on that, is so far for what is needed to achieve an agreement that you might question whether there's a real will to achieve an agreement. And frankly speaking, when I read the attitude of Prime Minister Johnson since he became a Prime Minister, my deep conviction is that Boris Johnson does not want a deal. What he wants is to be able to shift the blame to the European Union if no-deal Brexit happens. But no-deal Brexit is what he really wants, but without accepting to pay the political price of it in front of the British voters. That is what he wants to achieve. And, well, if you want an agreement, well, you need to have two parties who want an agreement, and the signals that we get from the proposals we got today are not really giving an indication that there's a serious will to achieve a deal from Prime Minister Johnson's side.
I didn't get an answer to my percentage chance, but Philippe Lambert, thank you very much for joining us. John.
So as we've been hearing, the new all-Ireland regulatory zone being proposed by the Prime Minister will effectively keep Northern Ireland in the European single market, but it'll mean the province comes out of the customs union. So what are the implications north and south of the border? Kieran Jenkins is in Dublin.
Well, here in Dublin and in Northern Ireland, the overwhelming preference is still for the backstop, the very thing that Boris Johnson's whole pitch is intent on ripping up. Now, this evening, many Northern Ireland farming and business leaders are fuming. Boris Johnson's plan has been described variously as unpalatable, unworkable, and for some, ruinous. But the DUP is on board with that suggestion, as you say, that Northern Ireland's alignment with parts of the EU single market requires an opt-in effectively every 4 years. But Sinn Féin have already told us tonight that an effective DUP veto, as they see it, simply isn't going to happen. They won't let it happen. And as for a customs border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, that alone is simply unacceptable to so many people here in Dublin, they say, for obvious historical reasons. And nobody I've spoken to here can see how Ireland's Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, and therefore by extension the EU, could ever agree to these proposals as they stand. If Boris Johnson's hopes of a Brexit deal rest on this man's approval, it could be dead on arrival in Brussels. The Irish Taoiseach, shortly before the proposals were published, hardly enthused.
From the leaks that we've seen, that what's being put forward is not promising and does not appear to form the basis for an agreement.
Boris Johnson had just given his conference speech. The Irish border, he suggested, a technical challenge.
If we fail to get an agreement because of what is essentially a technical discussion on the exact nature of future customs checks, when that technology is improving the whole time, then let us be in no doubt, conference, of what the alternative is. The alternative is no deal.
To say they see things differently in Dublin is an understatement. Would you describe the current problem as a technical issue, as he did?
I think it's much more than a technical issue. It's deeply political, it's legal, and the technical aspects are only a small part of it.
Customs sites were a target during the Troubles. The Prime Minister says there will be no checks or infrastructure along the border, but his plan states there will be a new customs border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Physical checks could take place at traders' premises or, ambiguously, at unspecified other locations. Ireland's main opposition, who the Irish government rely on to stay in power, say it's a non-starter.
What I see in this plan is a proposal from the UK government to erect a border on the island of Ireland. The very thing he said he wouldn't do, that his government wouldn't do, now that is his proposal, his solution to the Brexit paralysis in Westminster. And for Ireland and citizens on the entirety of the island, it is just utterly unacceptable.
Boris Johnson is saying that there won't be physical infrastructure, that there can be other solutions. Do you believe that that is possible?
No, I don't. I think Boris Johnson is misleading people.
The DUP leadership loved in with Boris Johnson last night at Tory conference, all in with his Brexit plan. Northern Ireland out of the customs union, but as for remaining in the EU single market for goods, the Northern Ireland Assembly and by extension the DUP effectively gets a rolling 4-year veto.
The principle of consent is also recognised because that was there in the joint report of December 2017. It was then forgotten about, but it is back in again, and we're very pleased to see that it will give the people of Northern Ireland the consent as to what way they want to move forward.
even if it somehow got past the EU and Stormont got back up and running. Sinn Féin are already promising to scupper Brexit votes in the Northern Ireland Assembly.
We will not support or vote for anything that affords to the DUP, arch Brexiteers in the DUP, a veto.
And what of that hard-won deal that did get across the line? The Good Friday Agreement secured peace and did not countenance the return of borders here.
So I think Boris Johnson, again, is playing fast and loose with the Good Friday Agreement. He's seeking to try and dilute the backstop and the protections that we need. And he's obviously trying to curry favour still with the DUP by attempting to afford them a veto.
Boris Johnson insists his plan respects the Good Friday Agreement. He and the Taoiseach have now spoken by phone. It wasn't a total no, but it certainly wasn't a yes.
Well, we're joined in Dublin now by Irish Senator Neil Richmond from the governing Fine Gael party and by Naomi Long, who's leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland. Naomi Long first. The DUP are backing this deal, the ERG too. Are you not?
No, I'm certainly not, Cathy, and there are very good reasons why not. I mean, I noticed in your VT that Arlene Foster was lecturing people about the principle of consent, but the reality is that the majority of people in Northern Ireland didn't consent to leave the EU in the first place, and so she is on very, very rocky ground to now say that we get to consent as to how we leave the EU, but not whether we leave the EU. I think when it comes to the Assembly having a role in this, I don't think that is either practical or workable. Not only would it give the DUP essentially a veto over our future, not just in the single market but in the single energy market, which is hugely important in terms of Northern Ireland's alignment, but it would also give the a local assembly a veto over government policy in the Republic of Ireland and in the UK. Now that's a bizarre situation and one that just simply won't hold water.
OK, Neil Richmond, economically speaking, isn't any deal preferable to no deal?
Well, this mistakes the whole point. This isn't just about economics, it's about responsibilities, and it's very much about the Good Friday Agreement, which Naomi so eloquently speaks about. The British government has that responsibility as a co-guarantor of that agreement. The British government has committed, alongside the European Commission in the December 2017 joint political declaration, that there will be no additional infrastructure or checks on the island of Ireland, and we very much hope they can meet that commitment. And whilst this document does require further study, and there will be discussions in due course, it comes some way short of what we had previously agreed.
Well, Naomi Long, are you not at all swayed by the potential promise of a new deal for Northern Ireland, i.e. lots of cash potentially?
No, because I don't believe that the current Prime Minister is someone whose promises can be taken at face value and relied on in the long term. We've seen him do a vote fast already. He was part of the government that signed up in 2017 to the particular agreements about protecting the agreement, protecting the all-island economy and ensuring there would be no additional infrastructure on the island of Ireland. And yet now today he's announced a plan which will lead not to one border but to two borders, one between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK and one between North and South and Ireland. And I just think that for the Prime Minister to think that he can bribe us with promises of cash, perhaps that has been his experience with the DUP, but it isn't going to be his experience with other parties who are actually dealing with this in a way we want Northern Ireland to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, to be able to grow economically, to be able to be stable politically and to be able to mature as a society. What we don't want is simply more handouts to pay us essentially to take a hit over this. 40,000 jobs could be at risk if we end up exiting with no deal, and there's nothing in the paper today which suggests to me that this is a serious bid to get a deal. I hope I'm proved wrong, Cathy. That would be ideal. I would love us to get a deal, but I'm just not convinced the Prime Minister is in the right space to do that.
Neil Richmond, the Prime Minister denies that there are two borders. Do you believe that this keeps the Good Friday Agreement intact? There won't be a hard border?
Well, as I said, this requires a little bit more study. I've only seen the letter and the explanatory memorandum. We'll pore over the detail of the full technical details in due course. But unfortunately, the language and the rhetoric certainly poses a threat to the Good Friday Agreement, and it certainly runs contrary to the spirit of the backstop and the joint declaration, which were brought about over tortuous months of negotiations, that certainly does protect and provide the guarantees for the Good Friday Agreement. This is a very complex matter. Saying that the customs division is somehow just a technicality misses the point completely. We very much want to engage with the British government. We want to do that rationally. We're open to consultation, but they need to be realistic of both their responsibilities and where the European Union stands.
But don't you need to be open to compromise as well? Boris Johnson says the UK has compromised, now it's the EU's turn.
Well, the EU has spent the last 3.5 years compromising. We've got to remember that Brexit is a British decision. It's a decision that comes with responsibilities. Initially, it was about leaving the EU. Then it was about leaving the single market and the customs union. Then it was about changing the original backstop so the customs wasn't just a Northern Irish specific thing.
Well,
the
give
EU
us a compromise that the EU's
ready,
made.
willing and able.
I mean, you know, some people think the EU has been absolutely intransigent.
No, that's far from the truth. The EU has been flexible. This isn't something of our making, of our desire, and we've worked with the British government as they've changed their mind and changed their red lines on many occasions. What we have said is we'll listen to any credible proposals, but any alternative to the backstop still must provide the guarantees and assurances that the backstop does. We have to very much take this on its merits. It will be studied, but basically on the first reading of it, it's very disappointing and it's some way short of where it should be.